Sarah. We are all aware.
Yeah.
This is awesome. I'm really pleased to be a part of this group tonight. So thank you so much. I will share my screen in just a moment, but first I'll just share a little bit about myself. I am the founder of UpSwing Health Coaching, and I'm based out of Washington, D.C. It is, in all honesty, totally getting late on the East Coast, and I am a morning person. So, if the energy dips, bear with me. But this is a cool opportunity. I don't think there could be a better time to talk about health as we move into our new transition. I have about 14 years in the A&D industry in one capacity or another. For about 12 years, I was an environmental graphic designer at a few larger architecture firms here on the East Coast. Now I contract environmental graphics, and I work with men and women on protecting their physical and their mental health in effect to combat burnout. So the latter is quite a departure, as I recognize, from graphic design. So in a moment, I'm going to share a little bit about how that actually came to be. But before we dive in, I'll just let everybody know what we're up to here and frame up what we're going to do tonight in our time together. We're going to be talking about setting healthy boundaries. And there's a few reasons for this. It's one of the topics that I discuss most with women in A&D and other industries across the board. Who I work with in a coaching capacity. It's been true since the day I started coaching. And also Sarah and I were just talking about now is a really crucial time to be talking about boundaries and how our values drive our choices, because we're at another transition point. We're about to navigate going back to the office. How do we want to hang on to some of the things we've learned about ourselves in the last 18 months? I just spoke on a panel a week or two ago about how anxiety, like what do we do as we navigate this change and be real about what we're going through. So I'm going to share a little bit about my story so you understand how I went from design into wellness, and then we're going to dive into boundaries, mainly how we frame them up as a positive thing, how we get comfortable with being uncomfortable so we can uphold them. We're going to talk about gaining clarity on personal values and why it's important. And then we're going to get a little experiential, and I'm going to ask everyone just to, take a moment tonight to reflect on what they learned, their experiences, and we'll map out a way to start really small. So, holding your boundaries isn't as scary as it can often sound. I'm going to share a little bit about a program I run for women in A&D called By Design. And then lastly, I'm hoping we have some time for questions and for conversation. I think that when it comes to mental health, there's often a stigma around it, and we're in a tough industry, and so conversation is important. So if we can get people talking, I think that would be really great. So let me hope that I can share my screen here and all goes well, and then we will get rolling. All right, cool. Let me move this up here. Okay. So let's dive into here. So in 2017, I was working at an architecture firm in DC, a great firm, actually. And like many of us, working at a pretty intense pace. And on paper, life seemed good. I had been promoted, was lead designer on some pretty high profile clients, all good things, right? And I was exhausted. I was probably at my lowest creativity level ever, and the days just felt like they flew by, like indistinguishable, I would say. And I felt in my core that I had this kind of ridiculous amount to be thankful for, but like the real feel of appreciation and gratitude was just like so hard to embrace, and I felt pretty isolated. But no one was really talking about the emotional toll or like these intimate nuances of like what it is to be a woman in design, like tears at night or running into the bathroom after you had a tough client call, like anxiety in the morning, the struggle to relate to my husband and other people in my life when I came home in the evening. Or like simply the fact that I was running out of energy to do the things I loved in life. And I think there's a common misconception for a lot of us that burnout is simply from overworking, but that's not always the case. And there are 6 factors that can lead to burnout. They are, of course, workload, a perceived lack of control, reward effort imbalance, both intrinsic and external, community, fairness, and values. And so for a while, like, yes, I was working hard, but for sure I was experiencing a perceived lack of control and an imbalance in that effort versus reward. And for me, I realized it was intrinsic reward, like what actually mattered to me. So at this time, my boundaries slipped for sure, right? Both personal and professional. And what I learned was that it wasn't all external forces that were having this impact on me. It was a lot of my own choices, actually. And even when people were giving me the option for self-care or downtime or health, I was just like pushing, 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 and like building up this false narrative about success. Um, and we hear dramatic stories about burnout and exhaustion from people. Like I always think of Ariana Huffington, right? Like she fell, she hit her head, she had to get stitches, and this was her burnout wake-up call. But I wasn't experiencing anything so dramatic. I was just operating at this like low level zombie buzz of burnout, and I normalized it for a really long time. I just thought it was totally normal. And I remember sitting late one night at the office I was working at, working on a deadline, in this moment of clarity. And I just thought to myself, like, what am I doing? Right? Like, what are we all doing? And people keep telling me that this is the way it has to be. And I got really curious, like, is this the way it has to be? And I started to wonder, am I literally the only one out here who is going to question this experience? And so I started to become interested in a couple things. One, like how different people were building habits and behaviors that lasted. Why was I like awesome, like a total boss at waking up for a 6 a.m. spin class, but I couldn't say no, to a project manager when they made a ridiculous request? Or I started to be interested or be really curious about like this definition of success, right? This elusive definition of success that so many of us were fed at a young age, especially women. Um, because I was headed there on paper, but I was like really unhappy. And lastly, I wanted to learn more about mind and body connection, like particularly when it came to my own thoughts and emotions and choices. So I'll move this along, like flash forward, I ended up discovering health coaching and working with a coach myself and getting certified. And I was so compelled with this idea of behavior and habit change that I decided I would take on that role. And I would go back and get educated in these processes and how I could help people, which was crazy, right? Like to be a designer for this long and then to say, oh, I think I can do this other thing. I mean, like, talk about an identity scare, right? So I was honest with my firm about what I was up to, and I slowly made, this organic transition out of design into coaching, into full-time in my business. There was a lot of scary mess in there, right? Like a lot of ups and downs, like no entrepreneurial journey is linear. That's kind of another story for another time. But basically, so I work with men and women in a lot of different industries. However, now I have this focus on women in A&D because, of course, you are my people. And this is how I ended up here tonight talking about boundaries, right? So let's dive into it. Okay, so there's a very good reason that we say yes and we get involved and want to succeed and serve others. It's a really, really good thing, actually. And if there's anything the world needs right now, it's compassionate leaders, okay? But sometimes it becomes precariously dangerous when we begin to push others' agendas forward without, being true to our own. And there's a fine line in what results as a ton of obligation, and for a lot of us, actually a lot of resentment. And it's not goodwill. So I want to acknowledge that just right off the bat, just being women, along with our race, culture, age, sexuality, all are statistically showing that it's more challenging for us professionally. Okay, we have to acknowledge this if we're going to give ourselves permission, like to have this conversation and then to do the uncomfortable work of setting boundaries to protect our physical and our mental health. And it means that setting boundaries will be more difficult. And yet, if we don't, the risk for us as women will be greater. So I want to right off the bat say that and acknowledge that being uncomfortable as we set boundaries can no longer be an excuse because we have to protect ourselves. So boundaries are not hard lines etched in stone, okay? It's not only our right, but our duty to set boundaries and assess often if they're actually working for us or not, particularly as we grow and change. And we often think that we're stuck because we've done something one way for a really, really long time. But that's inaccurate, right? And it's unhelpful because we're evolving beings and therefore our needs and our boundaries will always be adapting too. And I know we all are sitting here as we move through some of the changes right now, and it's frightening to express to someone like, okay, this is how you know me, or this is how you knew me at one time, but I want something different now, and I'd like something different for myself. And in fact, as the country opens back up, this is something that can keep us stuck. So it's cool we get to bring awareness to this tonight. And I always like to think about it this way, how boundaries evolve, right? Like when we just imagine there was a time when you met like your best friend or your partner, and the first time you met them, right? You may have said hello from a distance, or you may have like shaken their hand. And I mean, now you see them and you squeeze them tight, right? Like, and you hold them. That is a physical boundary that has evolved as your relationship grew. So again, not only are we allowed to change and grow, but it's healthy. And we're supposed to keep ourselves in check. So remember, regardless of what's going on to this moment, you have an innate right to grow and to change and to request different things. The second thing I want to point out is that boundaries are not walls that we put up around ourselves so that no one can touch us, okay? If we're setting them correctly, boundaries actually enhance the quality of connection between ourselves, the people around us, and our environment. Because boundaries are there to enrich our experiences, the ones that we choose. But that's the operative word, right? We have to choose and we have to be choosy. So boundaries take courage. Boundaries also require the space to be critical and think about what matters to you, not what matters to those around you. So I don't want us to like fill up on this deep sense of shame around our struggle to hold boundaries, because we're not perfect. All of us, this is a work in progress. All of us are constantly working on this. No one arrives one day at like perfect boundary behavior, okay? And it's really important to note that no matter what we're doing, no matter what behavior it is that we want to change, there is a positive intention when we're kind of like flexing or breaking our boundaries, or we're failing to uphold boundaries. And you might be thinking to yourself, like, what? Like they lead to burnout, they cause harm in my life when I break my boundaries. How could this be helping me? But think of it this way, like our behavior is always, always helping us in some way, or we wouldn't be doing it, okay? It might be yesterday's solution to today's challenge, and chances are that the solution just probably needs to be updated, okay? So here's a good example. I used to go to happy hours religiously on Fridays to be part of the team, okay? It's helping me, this behavior, because it helps me connect with coworkers and blow off steam after a stressful week, right? It's like, I mean, it's fun. It's a fun thing to do. However, it often left me exhausted for the start of the weekend, right? And I was unable to make the best use of my Saturday and my Saturday morning. I was slow, I was dragging. Yet I kept saying yes when invited. Why? Because I didn't want to ruffle feathers, okay? So the cool part about this, as we examine why things are important to us, is that we get to keep the positive intention of the behavior, connecting with coworkers, being a part of the team, having fun, releasing stress. But we are at choice with how we express ourselves and update the behavior, meaning like, okay, I want to hang on to those values, but what else could I do instead? So we update the mechanism of how it happens. Do I have to go to a bar? Can I have one drink and go home? Can I go for a walk with my best friend instead? Let's take another example of this one, positive intention. So a lot of women I work with feel tethered to their phones, right? Tethered to their phones and emails. They check email at night, sometimes in bed, right? Why do we do this? We can identify the intention is because it helps you feel valued and needed. You're keeping things moving, keeping the team informed, the project is moving forward. maybe less overwhelming in the morning for you, shows people at work that you care when you're working extra hours. But here's how it's harming you, right? It hurts because you don't connect with your family or your partner. Maybe it riles you up, right? Before you're supposed to go to bed, and it messes up your sleep. It lets people think that you can always reach them, and it sends a bad example. However, we keep doing this, right? Because we think it will help us advance, and it shows our work ethic. Okay, so again, we get to choose a new behavior and hold on to those values. So maybe you want to update. Maybe you stop emails at 6:30 p.m., leave the phone downstairs, let others at work know that you're unavailable. So I bring these examples up, whether they land with you or not, because without examining why we're doing something, why we're breaking a boundary in the first place, it's hard from a behavioral standpoint to land on a new way of doing something that feels true to us. Because these are our boundaries. They're all unique, and we all get to choose what feels right and what's good for us. So we have to understand why we were doing them in the first place, because if there's parts of us we like that we don't want to leave behind, we want to bring those with us. We just want to behave in a different way. So let's shed some light on common reasons that we might be struggling with boundaries. And as I go through this list, I just want you to pause and reflect on where these things land for you. This list is not exhaustive. It may trigger something else in you. But building awareness is so, so important in our behaviors and our habits. And we can't do much until we know ourselves a little bit better, until we're really self-aware. So just notice if I say something that, makes you uncomfortable, that catches your attention. And we're going to take a look at what you might be believing that could be hindering you when it comes to boundaries. So here are a few, what I like to call outdated beliefs that keep us from holding our boundaries. Okay. And the first one is that we have no right. It's pretty simple. We literally look at other people who say no, but we don't think that we have the clout or the power, or we're not there yet, or we haven't quite done enough yet. And this one is so troubling, right? Because we compare ourselves to others, and it breeds resentment so quickly. Second, we believe that people will leave rather than invest the time to respect us. We imagine that people will write off our friendships. We imagine we'll get fired or kicked off the team. We imagine we may lose the client. In many situations, right, like this isn't true, but I would not tell you that it isn't always true, right? Like sometimes we will lose people, we will lose things that aren't meant to be ours because they don't hold the same value as us. And that's an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge that. But it's also often how we find ourselves in toxic situations that continue to harm our health. Next, putting up with boundaries is cold-hearted, right? So this is really interesting to me. It's kind of like that idea of the badge of honor we talk about. We believe it's brave or fearless to always be on and sell ourselves for the hustle. Really, in our society, it takes a lot of vulnerability and courage to say enough, or to say no, or to say, I actually need help. The next one is my personal favorite, and it's the idea that if I'm capable, I should do it. If I have time on my calendar, it's for the taking. And if I am capable of leading that cause or that team, or making the pie for the neighbor, instead of sitting on the couch and maybe just giving my brain and my body a break, I should. Otherwise, I'm lazy. So I say yes. This one, like hands up for me. And guilt. Guilt is a driver in this one. And lastly, we have an outdated belief that putting up boundaries means that you're inflexible and unwilling to go with the flow, which is like total BS, right? You don't have to listen to someone else's definition of go with the flow. We all get to choose our own behaviors and what feels good to us. So just take a moment, even just to pause here, because this stuff, as you read it and as I say it, sometimes we like identify, right? Like I may have said something that totally caught you, and you were like, oh, that's totally me. But what I want you to notice about these things is just that thinking about upholding boundaries, I mean, even right now, probably makes us uncomfortable, right? Like the butterflies in the stomach, the sweaty armpits. We all know these feelings when we get in the situations. Um, but here's the deal, okay? Like these sensations in our bodies and these emotions of fear, anxiety, worry, doubt, these let us know we're actually doing the work, okay? If you take nothing else away from tonight, I want you to remember that you are not your thoughts and your feelings, okay? Meaning you can feel these things and still embody the courage to stand up for yourself. So next time you feel discomfort, I want to encourage you, don't stop. In fact, move into it deliberately. Courage can walk right alongside fear. I always imagine them right as parallel lines in my mind because the fear wants something good for you. And the challenge is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So let's talk about what guides our boundaries and how do we even know what to uphold, right? Like when do we draw the line? This means we're going to talk about identifying our personal values, okay? So I like to think of our values as our personal North Star. Values are fundamental beliefs that guide our actions and they really dignify the way we feel and think about certain things in the world. They help us to determine what is important to us and the traits that we want to embody as we navigate who we want to be in this world and how we want to relate to others. So values, just like boundaries, are totally uniquely yours. It is also important to keep a close eye on the fact that you know and can identify your own values so that you do not take on the values of others. So values are important because they allow us to take action in a way that's helpful and growth oriented, right? Even when our thoughts and emotions don't align. So they give us a lot of clarity. This means that when we know our values, they can provide motivation when we don't feel like doing something. Like they can help us to follow through when things are scary or unusual because maybe it's the first time we're attempting them. Values dignify a human experience because we will always have challenges. We will always have strong emotions that are hard to deal with. Yet we can respond rather than react when we come from our values. So let's return to the example that I gave earlier about the emails in the evening, right? If I value freedom in my evenings and the time to connect with the people I love, I can still come from that value and choose a behavior rather, even though I might be feeling guilty about not responding to those emails in the evening. I can choose a value, I can choose my behavior to be with my family or to put my phone down, even if I feel a different way. So values give us motivation regardless of what we're feeling. So when it comes to burnout and exhaustion and protecting our mental health, multiple studies have shown that connecting to what's meaningful matters a lot when we're stressed and overloaded. And as I mentioned earlier, a myth about burnout is that it's simply about overload in terms of time and tasks. But a huge part of burnout is the imbalance of effort versus reward, as well as having agency and purpose in one's work. So values congruence, or the degree to which work is connected to personal values, is also related to these aspects of burnout. It makes sense, as well as the feeling of being, generally ineffective. So while overload matters, being connected to your values may matter even more, actually, at the workplace. And connecting to our values, it dignifies so many of our challenges. Like I said, one study even found that people who spent time thinking and writing about what they valued had lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol in stressful situations. So the connectivity here of like what you stand for is rather important in protecting your mental health within the workplace, which I find to be pretty interesting. So the next piece about this is that values guide our goals. So I'm a goal setter. Anybody in this industry is, right? Believe me, I think it's so very important to get clarity on what we'd like to achieve. Plus, goals, they ultimately push us further had we not defined them at all, right? And while goals are super, super helpful, they're not to be confused with values. So living a values-driven life, particularly when we're strengthening our boundaries, helps to pursue what matters and yet kind of like enjoy and stay in the journey, right? Because regardless of the outcome, there are so many things that we don't control. So there's a couple ways to distinguish how our values can guide us. And I like to parse this out a little bit. Is that a goal is what we do, a value is who we are. A goal is set externally, and a value is core to who you are. A goal is a set target. A value is a continuous embodiment. So goals are the stepping stones or targets on the way of us living into our values. So even if our goals don't necessarily get reached, right? We can still live a fulfilling life if we're keeping on track with our values. And it helps us to stay in alignment with how we connect with other people and keep us safe by setting healthy boundaries. Okay, so let's talk about how we kind of put this all together, okay? How do we identify our values so that they can help us to shape and uphold our boundaries? And then how do we effectively do that? So oftentimes you might have the experience of picking a new goal or expressing a desire to embrace a new value, or setting a new boundary even. And the action can seem huge, and really lofty, right? And so we'll procrastinate or we'll stall for fear of failure. And we all do this, right? We pick really big tasks, really big challenges, and then we look at it and we're like, how do I even begin? What is even my first step here? So we may recognize that it will require such a change or a shift in our normal behavior that we'll do nothing at all. And this is part of totally our wirings for survival, okay? Remember that we're wired as humans to stay the same. And that's often why boundaries also feel difficult. When we hesitate or procrastinate or to change something about our behavior, it's our brain kicking in into protection mode, to keep us safe. So as we define our values and start to analyze how we might hold better boundaries for ourselves, it can be really helpful if we break things down and really back into what we want, okay, and get a lot of clarity there. So what I mean by backing into something is to keep our ultimate goal in mind, but also gain clarity on the small steps that would indicate that we're headed in the right direction. So basically, what are our stepping stones on the way to, our ultimate goal? And when it comes to building habits and changing behaviors, and especially expressing new boundaries, I like to help people move ahead in the tiniest, easiest way possible. And that's what I call 1% increments, okay? 1% simply means what is the smallest, easiest thing you can do to make a choice that moves you towards your vision and values, as opposed to away from what you desire, okay? So consistency will always trump magnitude when it comes to healthy living and behavior change. One, because we're producing a compound effect or a snowball scenario day after day after day. And I think of this as like a retirement account. Not only will this start to happen in our behavior, but it starts to happen in the brain itself. And two, what you're actually doing when you take these consistent small 1% steps is that you're actually mastering the habit of showing up for yourself. And that's the hardest part. So you're affirming your identity as someone who makes a particular choice over and over again. So in one of my favorite books, Atomic Habits by James Clear, he says, imagine a plane taking off from LA and directing to New York. If the pilot decided to adjust the course by just 3.5 degrees to the south prior to departure, the plane would slightly move a few centimeters and no one would notice. However, throughout the journey, the impact of this little change would be tremendous, and the plane would end up in DC instead of New York. So I always like to remind people that your commitment to starting small and upholding boundaries and changing behaviors by the tiniest, smallest 1% can actually yield a huge result. So let's go back to our example, okay? One more time so this is clear, and how do we break things down into small steps so that we can move forward without getting scared and getting stuck. Okay, so ultimate goal, log off every night by 6:30 p.m. and spend time with your family. Remember, that's what's been happening up until now is you're checking emails up until bedtime, sometimes 11 p.m. People know this about you, right? They know this about you, so this is a tricky situation. And it sounds like a huge leap just to start doing this. So let's get back into this little flow that I outlined here. So what are the values that I want to embody, right? I want to be present with my family. I want to take care of my body. I want to be in integrity. I want to focus on teamwork, and I want to be a good mentor. So what are the smallest things I need to do to back into my value-driven boundary? The first thing is I want to tell my husband that I have a new goal and I need some accountability. My next 1% may be that I'm going to pick my day and I'm going to block it on my calendar. I pick Wednesdays. I work on this for, say, 2 weeks. To let people know about my availability. Then I communicate the next step and how I'm going to grow this. And so now I'm adding in Mondays. So as you can see, when you back into a boundary or you back into any behavior change or any goal, when you pick the tiniest steps possible, it all of a sudden starts to become really clear how this could actually happen. So I'm hoping that this makes sense to everyone because we're actually just taking something massive and we're making it tangible again. It's almost like when you start a new project, right? I mean, and you start with the first document, the first drawing, and it helps us to stay out of overwhelm and stay in action when we think about our 1%. So this isn't a lot of information, like right away, like right now. So I kind of want to pause. I want to pause here, and I kind of want everyone just to have a little bit of time to reflect and think about this idea of what are boundaries in your life that you're working to uphold? How can we align them with your values, and how do we back into them just by like some really teeny tiny steps? So I hope everybody's up for this. I want this to be a little interactive. And you can just do it on your own. We don't necessarily have to talk or verbalize this yet, but grab some paper or anything you have handy, a notebook. Just go ahead and grab that. None of this that we're going to do in the next couple minutes will take about 5 minutes to think, and none of it has to be set in stone. This is really just about dipping your toes in and starting to think about some of this information and what it actually means for you. I always like to say that it's really helpful to move thoughts from like head to hand. It makes such a difference in how you're actually experiencing something. So first things first, like I just want you to, think of a boundary or a behavior that you would like to change or challenge or grow. Just go ahead and jot that down. And next, I want you to try to identify that positive intention behind the behavior. Why might you be doing this? How is it helping you? Can you see the good aspects of how it might have been a solution for a problem that you might have? I encourage you just to go with your gut. This can be a funky process at first, but you can always come back to this because it's recorded. The next question we want to take a look at is what values, as you break this boundary, are not being honored, right? So let's put it in the positive. What values would you like to embody instead? Values can be single words, they can be short phrases, anything that comes to mind. It's almost like asking yourself, man, if I was doing this differently in my more ideal way, what values would I be embodying? Who would I be? What would I be doing a little bit differently? And the next question is get clarity on what you would like. What's the goal? What's the boundary? What's the ultimate behavior? What you would love to see that would be different than what you're experiencing right now. And as you start to imagine that ideal experience, go ahead and start to brainstorm your 1%. Can we back into this massive goal? Like, even what is the first thing, the first 1%? What is the tiniest thing that might have to happen? And probably if you're coming up with a small thing or a 1%, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, that's way too easy, you've probably landed on the right thing. You've probably landed on the right thing. So keep it really simple. Because what happens when we keep things small and simple is that we stay out of overwhelm and we're able to be in action towards building stronger boundaries and changing our behaviors. I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds here to brainstorm about your 1%. Cool. And this is something you can come back to. It's a practice we can come back to over and over again, not just for boundaries, but for all behaviors in general. When we notice something that we want to move away from in life, it's so helpful to understand and have clarity on what we're actually moving towards. So I'm going to pause here. I'm hoping that when we stop for conversation and questions, we can kind of come back to this and have a more open dialogue about what it means to find these things and to find our positive intentions. Before we do that, before I stop sharing, I'm going to let you know, share a little bit about the program that I run called By Design, and then we'll jump into questions and comments about the exercise and just about boundaries in general. So I'd like to share with you exactly how I focus my work with women in A&D. I coach one-on-one, and I also run this program called By Design. And I want to tell you how By Design came to be. So in 2019, I interviewed 35 women in the field, in the industry, asking them to share their stories around burnout, their hustle for success, and the trends they see in the industry when it came to mental and physical health. And I was and still am fascinated by, the growth of the WELL certification and the growing research that supports designers' roles in burnout. Yet I noticed this crazy paradox in that designers, engineers, contractors, everybody, the people who are creating these healthy environments for others, were among the most burned out people that I knew. So in my mind, it was like almost like seeing a personal trainer leave your session and like walk into McDonald's and like or smoke a cigarette or something like that, right? And it caught my attention. So I collected these 35 stories from these women so I could learn, and they shared with emotion and honesty and a lot of vulnerability, and it was fascinating. And it drove a lot of what I wanted to do in the industry. I didn't want to just talk about how we were experiencing burnout. I wanted to help women take care of themselves and move through it specifically. So By Design is a 10-week virtual course that unites women in architecture and design to reclaim their time, health, and freedom. It's a learning platform and a community, and a way for women to come together and better support themselves and each other, and change the future of the industry. So it's an interactive course. You get guided through simple step-by-step process to combat burnout and prioritize your mental and physical health. So from my research, I took 3 main topics and trends that I learned that women were specifically struggling with. And that was raising mindful awareness around physical and mental needs and the patterns that you build and experience. The second umbrella was building confidence and effective communication to honor your boundaries. So, a little sneak peek of what you saw today. And the last piece was nourishment, which is just a fancy way of saying, like, what do we do to build our life outside of the office so that we can be a whole person? So for each week, you get about 30 minutes of video content, and you get to practice practical tools and really simple steps and frameworks that help you take care of your mental and your physical health. And you get content, self-paced content, one-on-one coaching sessions with me, and 5 community calls that are pretty powerful in bringing women together and creating community, similar to what you do at AWA&D, and supporting each other. So we're in our first cohort now in the summer, and I'll be launching another group in the fall. I'm super pumped about it. A couple of the things that women are taking away from this, similar to some of the things we talked about tonight, but an increased sense of confidence and assertiveness in conversations with leadership and colleagues, the ability to notice their inner critic and take action in spite of fears, taking action from values as opposed to emotions in difficult conversations, exploring and implementing strategies to work downtime and rest into their day, the ability to challenge old patterns by delegating, asking for help, and saying no, and challenging ruminating thoughts and untrue constructs. So I'll share this now. Maybe we'll share it again at the end, but there's a couple ways that anyone here can get involved. There's going to be a 2021 fall cohort, and you can head over to the site, which I'll share again in the chat in a moment. And registration will begin in September. Absolutely anyone in this group can use the code for the discount. You can share with friends and other women in the field who you know struggle with mental health and burnout and support them in that. And also you can share with your firms. Would your organization benefit from offering this program to women within their 4 walls? So with that, what I would like to do is pause. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have a conversation and that you can ask questions.
I will also stop the recording too, just because if you might feel nervous about sharing. I kind of do, so I'm going to just stop that recording right now.
Yeah.